Welcome to our Fall 23 lecture series. Just a reminder, if any of you are interested in continuing education credits sponsored by the AIA, please sign the sheet in the table in the beginning and we'll make sure that you're registered. Tonight we have Witold Rybczynski. He's going to lecture on why ornament matters. The Department of Architecture welcomes Witold Rybczynski, architect, professor, and writer, to present his lecture, Why Ornament Matters, to accompany his latest book, The Story of Architecture. Witold is the Martin and Margy Meyerson Professor of Urbanism Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania. Witold was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and moved to Canada. He attended Loyola College in Montreal and received his Bachelor of Architecture and Master of Architecture from the McGill University in Montreal, where he taught for 20 years. He has also taught classes in design and development, architectural theory, and a freshman seminar on contemporary architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. Rybczynski is also the author of Home, A Short History of an Idea, and A Clearing in the Distance, Frederick Law Olmsted and North America in the 19th Century, which won the J. Anthony Lukas Book Prize. He has written over 300 articles on housing, architecture, and technology for such publication as The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, and The Wilson Quarterly. From 2004 to 2010, he was the architectural critic for Slate. His latest book, The Story of Architecture, shows how architecture ideas have been affected by technology, ecology, and social changes, and by changes in taste, from the Stone Age to the present day. This evening, he will give an illustrated talk about the different roles that architectural ornament has played in buildings over the ages, from ancient Egyptians, temples to the Rockefeller Center. I'm very interested. I was looking through his book, and I was looking at chapter 17 titled The Art of Rhetoric, which is roughly the kind of Baroque chapter, I think. Witold talks about Bernini's first architectural commission, which was the St. Peter's Baldacchino. In it, he says, Bernini's dazzling concoction, which was calculated to appeal to his patron and to the public alike, was almost operatic. As happened before in the history of architecture and would happen again, minimalism has been succeeded by maximalism. So maybe tonight we'll see which area of the spectrum we are, minimalism or maximalism today. All right, welcome, Witold.
Good evening. Before we start the lecture, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that Andrew mentioned, which was a course I taught, the freshman seminar. College freshmen, basically high school students. And Penn has a series of freshman seminars, and they're not about content. You can talk about archaeology or architecture or atomic physics. It's not that. It's rather to give freshmen who are coming from high school a chance to actually see a professor. Because over their next 4 years, they may not have a lot of contact with real professors. They'll be teaching assistants and all sorts of other people. And to guarantee that, I think there's 3 or 4 required freshman seminar. So my freshman seminar was called Architecture Today, and it was about why architecture today, why buildings look so different. I mean, why does Robert Stern's Comcast Tower look different than Norman Foster's Comcast Tower? And that was, so it was quite contemporary in focus, but I thought they should have some kind of historical background, and most of them would not have taken any courses in architectural history. So I had one class devoted to a history of the world in architecture. So I had 80 minutes to talk about architecture, and that concentrates you very quickly, where you realize you can't just make a list of buildings. You have to you have to tell a story, basically. You have to make a story out of history. And I realize, for example, and I'm talking to people who know nothing about architecture. And I realize, for instance, the story of architecture is very different than the story of, say, aeronautics. You know, the story of aeronautics is the Wright brothers, this funny looking plane, and then the planes get sort of more stable, faster, then you get jet engines. So it's a kind of like a line going up of technical improvement. And architecture isn't like that at all, at all, at all. Partly because it's an art, or a craft, but it certainly has an artistic element, partly because it happens in different places, different countries, materials change. But architecture is very strange because it starts here. Greek architecture feeds European architectural history for the next 1,000 years. So it starts not like this, it starts way up here, and architects are still going to look at the Parthenon. Le Corbusier went to look at the Parthenon. I went to look at the Parthenon. Michael Graves. Everybody goes to look at the Parthenon because it doesn't get better than that. And when you go, you'll find that out. And it's not about the pictures. I had taken 4 years of architectural history. We used to teach architectural history, you'll be surprised to hear. And I spent a whole semester just on Greek temples, but it was just slides. And when I saw the Parthenon, it was like, yeah. And Corbusier was a couple of years older than me, and when he saw the Parthenon, he almost gave up architecture. He said, how can you do anything better than this? And he spent about a week in Athens, and every day he would go up and look at it and wonder about it. So the story of architecture came out of that. It's not a history of architecture. It doesn't touch on every building, but it tells the story and tries to give you a sense of who built the buildings, the clients, the architects, the societies that produce the buildings. Architecture is a social art. It doesn't mean that everybody gets together and designs buildings, but it means that buildings represent society and are produced by society. The architect is the tip of the spear. But it isn't like painting. For one thing, architects don't build buildings unless somebody wants to build it and pay for it. So the people who start the buildings are the clients, not the architects. And we rely on the clients. So we're a different kind of art than painting and sculpture. It's certainly different than painting. So the book tries to make a narrative out of the story of architecture. And as Andrew said, it starts in the Stone Age and it finishes in sort of 2020. The great Czech writer Milan Kundera, who actually died last summer at 94, so he had a good long life, he said that writing is not about writing is not about preaching a truth. Writing is about discovering a truth. And a real writer is not a propagandist. That's why I'm afraid so many architecture books are not really very good books, because they start out trying to make a point. You know, modernism is the answer, or modernism isn't the answer. I wasn't doing that, and so this evening what I want to do is share with you one discovery that I made, and it has to do with ornament. But it's not a polemical lecture. I'm not here to tell you how to design buildings. I'm really telling you, what I am telling you is how we, the architects of the past, designed buildings for 2,000 years. You can say, we're going to change that. That's fine. That's a different argument, and it's not one that I'm making this evening. So why ornament matters? We can't really talk about ornament in 2023 without recognizing Adolf Loos, who in 1910 gave a lecture called Ornament is Crime. He was 40 years old, he hadn't built very much. And the lecture is not actually about architecture, it's a more general lecture. He hated tattoos, for example. I have no idea what he would say today. He would be very disappointed because he thought tattoos were both uncivilized, they were a mark of primitiveness, and they were a mark of sort of degeneracy. Even though, and I looked this up, in 1910, aristocrats were getting tattooed, not the common people, except perhaps sailors who were going to the Orient, but aristocrats, kings were getting tattoos. It was a sort of fad which, as it returned today. So his lecture became an article, it was published, circulated, translated, and eventually it became a real tenet of the modern movement because it coincided with the modern movement, and also Adolf Loos started to build. And he built houses and a large building in central Vienna. His lecture sort of got underpinning because now people could so actually see what he meant. And he was the first one who built stuccoed white walls with windows punched in them, and what became known as the international style. And by the 20s, with Walter Gropius at the Bauhaus, it really becomes one of the foundational elements of modernism. I would argue more foundational because there wasn't much else to modernism. There wasn't much technology in those early modern buildings. They didn't know how to do it, and they didn't have the money to do it. And they weren't America. America was full of technology, but Europe was kind of backward in construction. But what those buildings had was no ornament. They looked different. And in some cases, they were planned differently. So ornament, the definition of ornament is pretty low-key. It's adornment, embellishment, but it implies something that you add. As you have your basic thing, and then you embellish it. You make it more attractive, you add to it. So in a way, that makes it easy to say, well, what if we didn't embellish? We're just taking away one element. And what struck me when I was writing the story of architecture, and this is not a theme of the book, but it's something that came to me after when I was organizing a talk about the book, is that actually ornament has some very important functions. 5 functions that I came up with. Maybe somebody here will find number 6. The first 2 were suggested by John Summerson, a great British architectural historian, and he gave a talk at the AA in 1940, and he said that ornament had 2 discrete functions. And the first one he called surface modulation. What it means is that buildings have blank walls. If you're designing a theater, you've got a lot of blank walls and not much you can do about it. If you're designing a museum with skylights, you've got blank walls. So there's a lot of situations where, as an architect, you have a blank wall. What do? Well, you can make it all white. But that's not very lively. It's kind of, are all the walls and all the buildings all the time going to be white? I mean, Gropius would say yes. But an imaginative architect would say, wait a minute, we can dress this up, we can liven things up. So it's a kind of problem in building design. You have a blank wall, what do you do with it? And so a lot of ornament is simply dealing with the fact of blank walls. This is the entrance to a mosque in Isfahan, roughly from our Renaissance epoch. It's a very simple space. Mosques don't have windows. Persian mosques only brought light in through the drum under the dome. And so there were doors, not much, no arcades, nothing much going on. Except there's a lot going on. To me, it looks like you hung Persian rugs all over the building. But then it occurred to me, maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the building came first and the rugs came second. I'm not an expert in Persian architecture, but what looks like a very simple, uninteresting, sort of U-shaped nothing is an extraordinary space because of the ornament and because of that issue of what to do with all those walls. An earlier example, but a Venetian example, the Venetians were international traders, so they got influenced by everybody, by the Byzantine architecture, by Near East architecture, and they were an early example of globalization. The Palazzo Ducale, the Doge's palace, is an interesting building because it's, other than the St. Mark's Cathedral, it's probably the most important building in the city because it's a combination of City Hall, Supreme Court, White House, and Capitol, all one building. The Doge was elected and he lived there for his period of time, but there was also a great council chamber which functioned as a law court. And the upper floor is these large rooms, which were large meeting rooms. The Doge's palace was built over about 400 years. It was an agglomeration of buildings. So those funny two windows on the right-hand side relate to an older wing, which then gets integrated into as the building expands. You can see on the right, almost all buildings in Venice are brick. So if they were sort of form follows function modernists, they might have just done a brick wall, like as they did on the side, where there's a narrow canal there, so nobody really sees the side. But they wanted to liven the wall, to give it life. And so the wall is covered in pink and white marble tiles with these repeated geometrical patterns, basically wallpaper, architectural wallpaper. But if you can imagine the difference if this was just red brick versus this very delicate Venetian architecture, this sort of Venetian Gothic of this period is both, I'll get in trouble for this, but it's both effeminate and masculine. It's a very delicate, it can be extremely delicate and then very kind of solid looking. The other kind of architectural fact of this wallpaper is it takes your attention away from the fact that for some reason, and we don't really understand why, the window arrangements are all wonky. We know why, because the two right-hand windows predate everything else. But the rest of it, you look at those round windows on the upper floor, they're not equally spaced, they're kind of random, and you kind of feel, I felt that really the Venetians liked that. They didn't like regularity. They could have lined everything up perfectly, but they didn't. And the wallpaper sort of allows you to do that because it takes your eye away from the fact that there's an awful lot of weird geometry going on. Otto Wagner had a different problem in Vienna. This is an apartment building called Majolica House, which was a popular name for it. Majolica ware was this glazed ceramic ware from Spain, very brightly colored. And what's interesting is Otto Wagner was probably the leading architect and city planner in Vienna at that time. But these buildings, he was also the developer. So he couldn't pass on the extra money to the owner. He was the owner. So the facade is very simple. Each apartment gets a big window. The windows are all the same. They're very regular. It's a flat facade. There's nothing going on that would cost a lot of money. But then to make the building interesting, to liven the facade, he creates this incredible, this is a 6-story building about more than 100 feet wide, with this rose patterns all over it. It's just an extraordinary building. Adolf Loos, of course, hated it because this was the ornament is a crime stuff that he was militating against. But there's not only the tile work on the facade, you can see there are actually some three-dimensional lion heads at the top there, and then the cornice is extremely elaborate in terms of color. It's a five-story building. I think the first floor is shops and things, and then apartments above. Ralph Adams Cram at Rice, Ralph Adams Cram was a great Gothicist. He was the university architect for Princeton. He built Graduate College and the church, the chapel in Princeton. And Rice hired him to build a brand new campus in Houston. And basically they assumed he would build like Princeton Gothic revival in Houston. That's why they went to him. And of course, when he went to Houston, he realized the climate is different, the architectural heritage is different. Gothic would just look really strange in this dry desert-like climate. But he was a very experienced architect. He liked Gothic for campuses because Gothic allows you enormous freedom. Each building can be quite different. Gothic is you need some pointed arches, you need some towers, but you can make very different buildings using the same style that will hang together. But if you're doing a classical campus, you're kind of stuck. You're going to have a lot of columns all over the place and pediments, and it's going to be stone, which is expensive, whereas Gothic can be done in brick, like our quad, for instance. So it's more practical. So but it's not as attractive as wood, as stone. So he mixes. If you look at this facade, it's got different coarsework of brick. It's got the mixture of limestone and brick. It does have something going on with the arches, which is, I neglected to mention, he decided to invent an architectural style. He said, Gothic doesn't work here. Houston doesn't seem to have anything going on architecturally that I can sort of glom onto, so I'll invent a style. And he said, what if Gothic was invented in Southern Europe instead of Northern Europe? What if it came out of Italy and Greece and warm southern places rather than Germany and France? And so he sort of put together elements of Byzantine architecture, Moorish architecture, like those stretched arches are very Moorish, Mediterranean architecture, and he sort of invented a style. He was very successful because that style has kept going now ever since the 30s when he did this, or 1912 he was doing this. There are architects still capitalizing on that notion of this invented style, which has sort of now become part of Rice. I mean, it's simply what people associate with Rice. Here's a building by Alan Greenberg from 2016, 2020. It was completed. It's an opera house for the music school. And an opera house has a lot of blank walls. It's basically there's no inward-looking building. And if you have a blank wall next to a walkway, as you see here, what do you do? It's just going to make it all white or all brick? It's really boring. Just walk around Philadelphia, you'll find a lot of boring walls. It's a very sad thing. But Greenberg doesn't do it. Greenberg, look, he creates blank windows. He has these kind of pilaster-like shapes. He mixes up a lot of limestone and brick. He introduces various types of brick coursing. And his daughter did those colored ceramic panels. And she's an artist, and I'll talk a little bit more about that aspect of ornament because it's important. But simply by ornament is what makes this wall lively, what makes it more pleasant to walk by than if it was simply a surface of one material. The second function that Summerson described, he called it subjunctive, which he admitted was an awkward word. But he referred to ornament that looks as if it was something else. This is a gate designed and built by Samuel Yellen, who was a famous Philadelphia iron maker, nationally famous. There's Yellen hardware all over the country from those periods. And not so much the birds are birds, but the lower part, they're sort of flowers. And you know, they look like flowers, but you know intellectually they're made out of wrought iron. So there's this seeing one thing and knowing another. I'm not sure why that is attractive or interesting, but it is. Trompe l'oeil is like that. You look at something and you say, that looks like stone. I know it's not stone, it's painted wood, but it looks like stone. And so you have this funny thing going on. René Magritte's paintings are sort of like that. You look at one thing and you realize, no, it's not really this, it's that. I haven't researched this, and I don't know why it appeals to us, but it does appeal to us. Because trompe l'oeil and these kind of playing around with things has a very long history. Of course, the earliest subjunctive architecture were, for instance, column capitals. So the one on the left is an Egyptian capital where the column capital is made out of palm leaves. So again, you know, it's stone, but it's trying to suggest a palm leaf. The Greek one is, or probably this one is Roman, is acanthus leaves. And then you have caryatids from Greece, which are entire figures, right? Human figures that could not possibly support the weight of the beam, and yet they do. Part of the idea here, Summerson mentions, is you've got this very heavy weight carried by columns, and then the notion that the heavy weight is carried by something like foliage is a kind of contradiction. And that's part of the attraction, I think. And that's why column capitals have so often looked delicate rather than sort of, it's the opposite of making it look as if it really could support it. The Byzantine craftsmen were even more successful at this. So you could sort of, these are all 6th century, so you can sort of see the leftover Ionic capitals, but they developed a technique of carving marble sort of, I forget the word, underneath. So it looks like lace. So it doesn't even look like, it looks even more delicate because of this wonderful technique that they invented. One that was in the island of Marmora, where the marble all came from. I don't have time to go into that, but Byzantine architecture is one of the discoveries I made in writing the book, is that there's this whole world of Byzantine architecture was completely different than Roman classical architecture. So even here you can see it. You've got 3 columns, they're completely different. The Byzantines were not into, like the Romans were boom, 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 boom. The Byzantines have 2 or 3 columns here, maybe a couple together here, and they're all different, and the capitals are all different, and you can see some of the columns are made out of different colored stone, and they enjoy all that. It's not an authoritarian dictatorship as Rome was, and there were other aspects of this which I won't go into, but even the decoration of the arch on top of that column, which actually reminds me of some of Venturi's decoration in the big auditorium, has that quality. It happens here, it doesn't happen in the next one. And it's just a very different way of approaching architecture. But of course, the Byzantine Empire, which lasted much longer than the Roman Empire, was some distance away from Rome. It was kind of out of the mainstream, and then eventually, of course, it collapses when the Ottoman Empire replaces it. In the 19th century, you've got Leo von Klenze in St. Petersburg. these, when I first saw this, I assumed those are called Atlantes or Atlas. They're male equivalent of caryatids. I assumed as a modern person, well, they must have cast these in cast iron or something. No, these are sculpted out of black, some sort of black granite. So there's 10 of these guys holding it up. And this is almost a double what if, because von Klenze still has peers everywhere. So they're not like the Greek caryatids, they're added on. So in a sense, they're not taking the whole weight. They seem to be straining, so they're taking a lot of weight, but there's this funny connection between the architecture and the figures themselves. The Art Nouveau, of course, used a lot of foliage and various things. And here you can see in the column capital sort of starts off in a discrete budding sort of flower, and then it, boom, it explodes at the top. And then the same patterns get pulled into the railings and the wallpaper and various other things. The master of Art Nouveau in the United States was Louis Sullivan. It's important to underline that because he's been sort of dragooned into as a pioneer of modernism, which in many ways he was, but he wasn't, in many other ways, he was completely opposite. And certainly his love of ornament was not a modernist trait at all. And it's what makes his building so interesting and so good. This is a department store in Louisiana. And remember, Sullivan is the person who said form follows function. Form ever follows function, he said. It's a department store, so the spans are big. So basically it's 3 bays, long spans, and he just expresses that on the outside in a simple way. And apparently when he was finished, he said, "This is awful. This looks like a warehouse," or he didn't like it at all. And so he introduced those center elements, and he didn't put them over the structure, he put them in the middle. And they're terracotta, I don't know whether they're celery or trees or something. They're something that's very vertical, and then it kind of explodes at the top. I mean, they're what makes the building beautiful. And so form follows function wasn't quite enough for Louis Sullivan. He realized that he needed, and then when you look at the closely here, you will see using terracotta pattern tile at the top and the bottom. This strange object in the middle, I don't know what it is, but I know what it refers to. The owner of this building, Van Allen, was a Dutch descent, and he was very proud of his Dutch descent. It was an important part of his self-image. And so this is a kind of Delft blue tile arrangement that Sullivan puts in there as a kind of nod to his client. And that brings the next function of architectural ornament, which is meaning. Buildings, architectural elements, columns, beams, arches, don't mean anything. I mean, that's why we can talk about space and light, but they don't have meaning either. They're part of the experience. But my history teacher when I was a student was Peter Collins, and he wrote a book. You remember, he wrote a chapter called The Gastronomic Analogy. And he made an analogy between architecture and gastronomy, cooking, basically. Because he said they both serve people, they both deal with real ingredients, food, materials, and they both rely on taste. In cooking, literally taste; in architecture, visual taste. And they're both kind of services. I mean, the cooks don't invent things. They invent things because they want to serve somebody. Somebody's going to eat them. And similarly, architects don't invent buildings. They build buildings because somebody's going to use them and live in them and work in them. So architecture alone, but like cooking, you know, a beautiful vichyssoise soup doesn't mean anything. And maybe it means you like France, I don't know. But food isn't supposed to mean things. You're supposed to eat it and it tastes good and you like it. Architecture is a similar way. The basic elements of architecture don't mean anything. If you want it to mean something, that's where the ornament comes in. And there are buildings where you don't need meaning. In most residences is minimal. But in certain buildings, meaning is important. In a city hall, in religious buildings, and as you'll see, in a number of buildings. This starts very early. This is a mortuary temple in Luxor, and these are the columns. You see, Egyptians are very conservative builders. These are fat columns, but they have a shape. They're not just posts. They're not as elegant as Greek columns, but they're kind of interesting. But the ornament is meaningful. At the top, they're just some kind of colored bands. You have to imagine this would have been brighter colors originally. But down below, you've got hieroglyphs, which are about Ramses III, his life, his accomplishments, his family. I don't know, obviously I don't read hieroglyphs. But the meaning of those things is very important for this building. This is a mortuary temple, and it's about him, and that's what decorates these columns. Similarly, the Parthenon, the metopes, most of which are in London for the moment, as well as the figures in the pediment, are an important part of the Parthenon. We call it a temple. It wasn't really a temple. There was a temple on that site, and the Persians destroyed the temple when they occupied Athens. And this building was a kind of war memorial to say they can't stop us. It actually incorporates material from the old temple, but it's not a temple. It's a place where they kept important things of the city. So it's a kind of I'm blanking on the word, but it's like a storehouse for special treasures. But it's also a war memorial. It memorializes the ultimate victory of the Greeks over the Persians. And so the figures, for instance, the metopes showed warring centaurs and giant warriors, and that theme is carried throughout the building. So the meaning of these are not simply decorations, although they are decorative, but they mean something about the building itself, what the building is about. The same thing happens in Notre Dame. These are the three big arches. So from a distance, you're simply emphasizing this is the entrance. The doors are big, but the portals are, of course, much bigger because they are in scale with the whole building. But they're also a lot about meaning, because you've got saints and sinners and devils and bishops and figures that the ordinary churchgoers would recognize and interpret, but which are very much part of the meaning, the function of this building. So they're both decorative because they make the entrance much richer, but they have meaning. The doors, on the other hand, are simply decorative. They're decorated with metal work that's sort of organic leaf shapes, but which doesn't have, I think, any particular religious connotation. The Villa Barbaro was a villa by Andrea Palladio, 16th century, for two brothers. The Barbaro family was a very important Venetian family, and the two brothers, one of them was a diplomat and one was a cleric who was also a diplomat. And the first brother, Marc Antonio, was also an amateur sculptor, and we think that many of the sculptures in the building were done by him. And the pediment here, a broken pediment, includes, right in the middle is the coat of arms of the Barbaro family, and also the papal tiara. As this was a moment when there was a lot of conflict that some people supported the Papal States and some people thought it was a bad idea. And the Barbaros supported the Papal States, so the tiara was sort of a symbol of that political position. I've tried to find out what the iconographic symbolism, meaning of this pediment is, and I've never found it, so I'm imagining here, but I see it as the two brothers, the two bare-assed people that we see there. The right one wing of the house was the Marc Antonio and his family. The other wing of the house was Daniele, who didn't have a family. And then in the center, you have a sort of common spaces that are shared by the two brothers. And they're holding this classical symbol of the ox head or the ox skull. It's rather risque because they're also holding ladies on the side. So maybe it isn't the brothers after all. Here's a few hundred years later, the Folger Shakespeare Library was designed by Paul Cray from Penn, taught design here for years and years. Folger collected Shakespeareana, original folios. He had the world's leading collection of this, and he decided to build a museum to hold it, and it's located on Capitol Hill. And his first idea was he wanted an Elizabethan building so the whole building would send the message, this is what's in. His architecture advisor said that, having an Elizabethan building on Capitol Hill is just too weird. People will laugh at you, and you can't do that. The Library of Congress is next door. The Supreme Court is around the corner. So he said, okay, I won't do that. But he insisted actually the interior is Elizabethan. So there's an Elizabethan theater in the building, which is decorated as an Elizabethan in the Tudor style. But on the exterior, I think he was concerned. He didn't want his building to look like a federal building. He said, okay, it has to be classical, it'll be classical, but you have to do it so people will recognize this is not just a government building, because this is a private building. It's not a public, it's open to the public, but it's built with private money. And so there are these plaques, and Cray's classicism is very stripped down. People called it starved classicism because he kind of got rid of capitals, he got rid of bases, he got rid of a lot of stuff, and you've got these fluted, they're not even pilasters, they're just sort of panels. It's like getting it right down to the very minimum. But at the bottom of each of the windows is this 5-foot square panel with a bas-relief of a scene from one of Shakespeare's plays. There's 7 windows, and also there's 7 scenes of plays. And they're very beautiful. This is Henry V or the Fourth, Falstaff with the young Henry and somebody else on the other side. So you walk along and you know this is not the IRS or the FBI, this is something else. And it says Folger Shakespeare Library on top, but even without that, you would recognize, and this probably Shakespeare was at least as recognizable, maybe even more so than today to most people. This is a building in Philadelphia, the Nix Federal Building. Harry Sternfeld was a colleague of Cray at Penn. He was a design professor here for his whole career, and he got the job of designing the Federal Building. The Federal Building has a courthouse and a post office. The courthouse entrance is on Market Street, and there's sort of very muscular ladies and gentlemen representing justice and other things there. But on the side street is the entrance to the post office. And there are these beautiful bas-reliefs of, on the one hand, a cowboy picking up his mail, and there are cactuses, and he's got his foot on a box which has just been delivered to him, presumably. And then on the right, you have a mailman picking up the mail from a mailbox. And there's two doors, so there's two more of these different ones down the street. It's a beautiful thing because it says this is the post office. I don't know if you go to post offices anymore. I suspect most of you don't. I'm old-fashioned, so I do, but it's always depressing to go to a post office. It's just cheap. There's sort of cheap materials. The only thing that's left over from the time when of the pride that the post office had in itself was there's an American flag on it. But there's nothing else that tells you this is a federal building, this is an important building. This one is. I don't think it's a post office anymore because that seal says Department of State, so it's probably been converted. It's probably too nice for the post office, somebody said at one point. Another building by Cray, I'm a fan of Cray, so maybe there's too many here. This is an important building because, in my opinion, outside the White House and perhaps the dome of the Capitol, this is the building that is most exposed to the public in the media. Because every time the Fed makes an announcement, raises the rate, lowers the rate, whatever it does, they show Paul Cray's building. And they usually show the central part. And you can see how his sort of minimal classicism worked. There really are no classical elements here. Those piers have been stripped down to, you just have little bit of molding at the very top. And of course, it's not decorated. This is a very serious building. This is about money. I mean, our money, ultimately, the world's money system is run out of this building, and they meet in a room which is in that central pavilion. And so there really is no ornament. With the one exception, there is a American eagle and the center on top, which you often see on television when they're talking about the Fed. It's a wonderful sculpture. I'm always impressed by the talons. And it's a reminder that we think of sculpture as a sort of mimicry of the real. This is not a mimicry. Those talons are huge. Birds don't have talons that big, but it's because you see it from 40 feet down, and it's an expression of something. It's a very tough-looking eagle, which is what it's communicating. I mean, this is a place that runs the economy in many ways. Another example, and a more recent one, by Eero Saarinen, one of the most interesting architects of the mid-century period, one of the most inventive architects. There's a quote, I won't get it completely right, but it was something he said that modernism had created an architectural alphabet that went from A to B, and he wanted to do the rest of the alphabet. And so he introduces here ornament, not just the bird. He actually originally had a crest of the United States, and the State Department said, no, we want an eagle. And so Theodor Roszak was a friend of his, a Polish-American sculptor, and he created this huge, it's about 30 feet across, American eagle. But what's interesting, too, is how much ornament there is in this facade. You see at the very top a kind of frieze made out of anodized, I assume, aluminum, gold anodized aluminum. You've got these bars in the windows, which are anodized aluminum too. All this masonry that you see there is not precast concrete. That's Portland stone. Carved in the spandrels are almost a kind of, I don't know what they are, but they're something. They're not just flat. They create a more lively, and of course you've got the liveliness of windows. He was very criticized for this building. The English didn't like the eagle. They thought it was too big. The critics didn't like the ornament because modern buildings weren't supposed to have ornament. And then this pattern of windows, which is sort of similar to what he did on the house over here, the residence, where he plays with windows. I mean, he says, okay, we're going to have standardized windows, but we're going to have 3 different ones, even though the rooms are all the same. And we're going to make this geometrical pattern. Well, he's sort of doing something like that here. on a very big scale, much longer building than Hill House. There's a lot you can say about the Portland building. It's not, in my opinion, a completely successful building, but one of the most successful parts is this statue, which is a statue of Portlandia, who's a lady on the city of Portland seal, which is this woman holding a trident. Because that river was an important part of Portland history. It leads to the sea. It makes Portland a port, in fact. It's not, even though it's an inland city. And Graves had the idea of posing a statue on this plinth, but the city fathers said, well, yes, it's a good idea, but we would like to have a competition. We would like to see what somebody else might do. There might be a little too much Michael Graves in one building. And there was a competition, and Graves didn't win. Raymond Caskey won. Raymond Caskey was a young architect. He had never done anything remotely like this. He was horrified when he won because this is, I think he told me, the largest, this is basically the technique of the Statue of Liberty. In other words, it's copper on the outside, there's a framework inside. And he said this is the largest statue done that way since the Statue of Liberty. And he promised to do it, and he'd never done anything remotely like that in his life. And I think it made a very successful statue, not least because it's a modern take on a traditional figure. So she's not standing there with the trident. She's holding the trident, but she's kneeling down and she extends an arm, a hand, to the citizens entering this building, which is a municipal office building. Caskey did another interesting work on the Harold Washington Library, which deserves a whole, I talk about it in the book, but it's really a building which is full of ornament. But he created these owls, and I wanted to put it in terms of meaning, because owls are symbols of wisdom, which seems appropriate for a library, and this owl is actually holding a book. And so here the ornament, again, has a meaning that relates to the building itself. The last two functions are sort of odd, but as you'll see in a minute, quite specific. If you're going to do ornament like the statue of Portlandia, you need an artist. The architect is not capable of doing that. And what it does is it introduces another sensibility into the building. It's not all the architect. We have come to the point, and I think this started with Gaudi and probably with some of the Art Nouveau architects, or who's the Glasgow architect? Mackintosh. And we say, it's wonderful, the architect did everything. The furniture, the plates, the dinnerware, the lighting, the lamps, the wallpaper, everything. He did everything, and that's kind of the ultimate. And I don't think it is. I think it's too much of a good thing. And it never was the ultimate. It's relatively recent, the notion that this is the ultimate thing, is to do the whole thing. I don't know if you haven't read, it's an interesting book called Broken Glass. It's about the Farnsworth house and the relationship between the client and the architect and the whole story. And of course it ends up with a horrible lawsuit and so on. But there's a funny scene in the book. The house is complete, and Edith Farnsworth has moved into it, and suddenly arrives a whole truckload of furniture that Mies has ordered for the house. And of course, it's all furniture designed by Mies, Barcelona chairs, all different tables, everything. And she sends it back. She says, I don't want this. And she's right. And there are pictures of the house. She furnished it she didn't furnish it like in Victorian chintz. She was quite sensitive, and obviously she was an admirer of modernism. But the kind of furniture she used was Scandinavian modern. So it was wood, she said the Mies furniture is also heavy, I could never move it, because it's all steel and a Barcelona chair must weigh, I don't know, 100 pounds? I mean, it's a heavy thing to move around. So she had leading Scandinavian designers, not just, it was no IKEA at that time, but so it was serious stuff, but it was not, and when you see the house, she had potted plants, like palm things, and rugs, kind of peasant-like rugs on the floors, and then this, and it looks like a real house, her house. And of course, if you go today, the National Trust has a fake house because it's all furnished with Mies furniture, which it never was. And you get a sense, and again, it feeds this, I think, mistaken notion that it's better if the architect does everything. And I really don't think it is. So introducing a creative sensitivity into the art enriches the building. Of course, the artist has to be on the same plane or on the same wavelength as the architect, but it's his own ideas. This is the Villa Barbaro, which I showed you, which is the decor inside is painted by Paolo Veronese, a great architect, a great painter. And we don't really know about this house, but we have drawings from another house where we see that Palladio draws the architectural framework, the columns and the arches, and then he gives it to Veronese and says, the rest is up to you. You know, the figures, the pile, and the military hardware in one corner, the view, what you see through. I mean, that's all Veronese. But it's quite possible that, and you see, this is a weird room. It's a cruciform room. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but the door on the left is a real door into that room. The door on the right is a fake door. It's only there to balance the door on the other side, which is a real door again. So Veronese, there's a real door frame, but everything else is painted. Then Veronese has one of the kids in the family poking their head out the door. And again, it's not something an architect would ever think of doing, but it makes the building wonderful. I mean, that's why it's by far the most visited of his villas. It's not particularly easy to get to, but you get Veronese and Palladio, so you get these two great talents, not necessarily working together, but working in the same place and creating a very rich. The bottom line here, of course, is that painting is cheaper than building real columns and real stuff. So there's a real economic reason why many of his villas used painting. They just didn't have the money. These were often second homes, and they weren't going to spend the money to make real stuff. Charles McKim in the Boston Public Library invited a number of artists to work in the building. And again, here you see how the art respects the architecture up to a point. It doesn't just fill the architecture with painting, and it creates a whole different atmosphere. And McKim was very clear. He invited these artists, but he didn't tell them what to do. It was a complete open blank slate. They could do what they wanted. They could pick the theme and they could pick the treatment. And he also invited John Singer Sargent. He gave him a whole room. This kind of vaulted room at the top of the stair, and he created the Triumph of Berlin. Is a whole series of paintings, which many people consider one of his great achievements. Just as a side light, I didn't notice this until I looked closely at the slide. The wonderful handrails. The handrails are not metal, they're actually carved stone with a shape. And it reminded me of a handrail that Louis Kahn did in McKimball, which is a wooden handrail, but also it's just a shape that runs up the side of the stair, but it makes for a nice, and it's sort of nice to have a change from the usual bronze or metal handrails. This idea of having other sensibilities is not an invention. Bertrand Goodhue was one of the great architects of the beginning of the 20th century, American architects. And if you read this quote, he's very clear. This is a strategy on his part. It's not something imposed by the client. It's not something, I wish I could do it myself, but I guess I'll have to get these other people in. This is how he thinks of the building. He's going to do this, and then he's going to get somebody who really knows about sculpture to do that, and he's going to get a painter who knows about colors. And there are architects who are painters. Le Corbusier was a painter, Michael Graves was a painter, but most architects are not painters. I mean, they have different skill set, and it doesn't include painting and sculpture. And there's no reason why it should. And so this was Goodhue's approach, and he worked with the same people, so it wasn't like picking names out of a hat. He had a team of people that he would regularly approach. He would bring them in and give them, again, a free hand. But since they worked together, they were able to understand sort of what he was trying to do and how they could fit in. Goodhue's an interesting architect. He's one of the few leading architects who did not go to the École des Beaux-Arts. In fact, he didn't go to a school of architecture. He was an apprentice. He learned that way. He was incredibly talented. By far the most sort of naturally talented of architects of that period. And he and Cram worked together first. Cram was older than him. And Cram was a Gothicist, and they did Gothic churches all over the country. They did the campus of West Point and the chapel at West Point. They did major churches in Manhattan. But then Goodhue got sort of restless. He wanted to try other things. He'd been on a journey in the Far East. He wanted in the Near East, in very Persia, and he wanted to try that kind of architecture. He just had too much talent, and so they broke up. And he went his own way. He designed sorry, my hearing aid is doing weird stuff. He designed the state capitol of Nebraska, beautiful building. The Central Public Library in Los Angeles. And he designed the National Academy of Sciences building in Washington. This is on the Mall, very close to the Lincoln Memorial. And he had to get his building approved by the Fine Arts Commission. And the Fine Arts Commissioners were all very classically minded. And they said, anyway, we just finished the Lincoln Memorial, you've got to do a classical building. And he really didn't want to, because he felt this was a building for scientists, and it needed to be sort of rougher and more creative in some way. But finally he designed a classical building, and he said, God knows what kind of classic, he said. Because it isn't really classical. It doesn't have the classical. They wanted him to put a colonnade on it, and he drew the line there. But it has you sort of get the classical feeling. It's a calm building. It doesn't really have any of the classical features. It has an attic, which is sort of classical. But he worked with these artists on the inside. So Lee Laurie, who was a very famous, we'll see more of his work, sculptor, did all sorts of things, lights, grill work. This is a close-up of grill doors. There's a big mural in the large hall, and there's this wonderful drinking fountain. I mean, who designs a drinking fountain? You just go to a catalog, boom, fountain. And I think it was Hildreth Mayer, who was a young woman painter who I'll show you in a minute, did big things there, but this feels like one of her things. And they're specially fired tiles. It's all sort of custom made, and the fountain becomes a little place. Again, nothing to do with classical architecture, nothing to do with the past, really. The Great Hall is at that point served as a lecture room, sort of like here, where they would set up chairs. but it also otherwise would be the central space in the building. And all the graphics that you see on the arches, and that's all Hildreth Mayer. Her first job, he gave her a job, I can't remember how old she was. She must have been around 30 years old, late 20s. And you can see the sort of classical, those columns are not capitals that you can identify in any way. You don't see it here, but the dome, for instance, has a lot of scientific motifs in it. The last thing is a kind of trivial thing, and yet in a way very important, which is that ornament gives you something to look at when you get close to a building. Corbusier said that architecture is a magnificent play of volumes in light, which is true, but that's only true from a distance. When you get close to a building, you need something to look at. And that's, in a way, one of the drawbacks of many modern buildings is they have big moves that they make, like Koolhaas's Central Library in Seattle. And then you get close, and what do you see? Neoprene gaskets, caulking, bolts. I mean, some architects are interested in bolts, but the public isn't that interested in bolts. They're not very uplifting. They don't tell you anything. Even when they're done as beautifully as, say, Renzo Piano, they're still just bolts. So if we look at the National Academy of Sciences again, you approach the building and the door is in the middle. You can see where it is. And then as you get closer, you realize there's it's like a little building. There's a pediment on top, and it's a sculpture, a very kind of imaginative pediment by Lee Lowry called The Evolution of Life. And so it's connected with it's telling you something, but it's also something to look at. You're approaching the building, you're walking up, and there is something to see. The other thing that is very striking at the beginning are the doors. These are bronze doors which slide into pockets. They're not actually doors, they slide and then you have doors, hinged doors. And they show the major figures of science, Galileo, I can't remember them all, but I've shown you a blow-up of one with Darwin on it. And again, there's something to see when the building is closed, because when it's open, they disappear. And there's a lot going on there. And when you think, if you just had a blank surface, it would be not very interesting. Forget the meaning for the moment and just think of what you need something to look at. The idea of big doors is very old. It comes from mainly the Middle Ages and Gothic buildings. The most famous are Ghiberti's east doors on the baptistry in Florence. The US Supreme Court has doors. I don't think very interesting design, probably because Cass Gilbert got involved and he should have let an artist, given them a free hand. And you can see Ghiberti's scenes are very active and they're not sort of geometrical, whereas the idea that every panel has to have two figures, they represent Magna Carta, all sorts of legal moments in history, but they're kind of flat. And very quickly to finish, I'm running late, American modernism was very different from European modernism. It was not governed by Adolf Loos. They never heard of Adolf Loos. No reason they should have. It wasn't interested in the Bauhaus. But it was very modern, much more modern than anything in Europe. This is the Daily News building, a very modern building, no ornament, virtually no ornament at all. These vertical lines are white brick. Raymond Hood was the main architect. He was, remember, the architect who designed the Chicago Tribune Tower, which was a Gothic building. But by the late 1920s, that Gothic had become really modernized and abstracted and simplified. But the entrance of the building is here on the street. And there he has what Hood called a small explosion. And it's a 3-story, low relief sculpture which emphasizes the entrance. At the bottom you can't really see, but there's figures representing sort of the New York street figures, so the public, the people who read the Daily News. And then the entrance is here. So it's a way of introducing something, both something to look at, something that has to do with the function of the building, as well as relating sort of to the past. Most people would not look at this building and say, "Oh, that's wonderful. It's very interesting." It is not supposed to be interesting. You're not even aware. Above 3 floors in New York, you don't really see much. So these, incidentally, the spandrels are black and red brick, and the lower spandrels have patterns. The upper spandrels get very simplified. The RCA building was Hood's last building. He died young, and I think still one of the great skyscrapers of New York. I wanted to share this quote from Gertrude Stein. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. There was a whole sculpture art program at Rockefeller Center. The main figure is this figure of Prometheus, which is a freestanding fountain figure, which you can see here. So it's lined up with the building and the entrance, but the entrance to the building is quite different. It's got this extraordinary combination of sculpture and architecture, because the sculpture, it's like a Gothic cathedral. It's part of the building. It's not added on. You know the old joke about putting Henry Moore in the plaza. I mean, that's 10% for art. You stick it as far away from the building as possible, but can you think of a modern architect today, or any architect today, who would allow this, an artist to cram right into the building? I can. And there are 2 more. There's 3 portals, the one in the middle, and 2 lower ones, and they all have sculptures, different sculptures representing. This was the RCA building, and these sculptures represent these new technologies of television, radio, the things going through the air. Some of the sculptures are much lower key than that, but they're in the building. They're part of the building. They're not even attached to the building as it is. They're sculpted out of the building in a sense. And some of them are just, the buildings in Rockefeller Center, there's an English building and a French building, and so the sculptures often relate to that, like this one, which has the British lions, and very low key. It's like almost just a graphic thing, whereas the one on the left is much more artistic. Radio City Music Hall on the other side of the Rockefeller Center has these 3 big medallions. They're 18 feet in diameter, and there's one, what's it? Music, drama, and song. And that's Hildreth Mayer again, and this is a close-up of the one about song. And again, this has to do with giving you meaning, because it's Radio City Music Hall, which of course you know because of the big sign, but it also deals with what to do with this big blank wall. The blank wall is kind of uninteresting to look at, and so these kind of give you some focus. There's around the corner, there's more medallions also by here, and I'd like to finish with this little building at Penn. It's chemistry labs. It's Paul Cray's, one of his very last buildings. He died in 1945. And it's one of his only buildings at Penn. He did funny little jobs at Penn, adding a floor to a building or little things. But this one is kind of the most substantial. It's not very big. I think it's really a shame that Penn had this person and didn't actually exploit him in any way and often used second-rate architects. But this is an interesting building because it's 1940. He's obviously aware of what's going on around the world. And I wouldn't say it's international style, but it's not a stripped classical building at all. It's got ribbon windows for the laboratories. In those days, presumably they needed more light. And then it's got this other interesting base, which is not just repeating something, but composing it. But nothing that you would call ornament on this building. So he's really gone quite far away from buildings like the Rodin Museum, which is another one of his buildings in Philadelphia. The entrance of the building, very low key, just the double doors with a little roof over it. But above it is this low relief plaque. And it's called The Alchemist, and it shows a medieval alchemist with all his gear and medieval clothing. So it's actually, it's as if, because all low relief is subjunctive. It looks like a sculpture, but it's only this thick. St. Gaudens made low relief sculptures that were like an inch thick. This is a little bit more than that, but it isn't really it isn't what it first appears to be. Of course, it has meaning because it's a chemistry building, so it's an alchemist. It introduces clearly another sensibility to the building. This is not anything to do with the sort of modern architecture of the windows and the rest of the building. And then it's something to look at. You approach the building. You don't have one of those stupid pen signs saying chemistry building. But you have an alchemist who's telling you. And so you have something to look at and perhaps even something to chuckle about. Thank you.